What is important is for him to understand that in this area, we're hitting our goals in yield, in energy, in whatever is most important. What's important for the staff is to know that when they track all of those data points, they can follow it to those outcomes. And a lot of times what you have is staff tracking data points and then someone else coming in to analyze them. That's insane. Of course, they're not going to trust that guy. Of course, that guy doesn't, have the right perspective and he's going to miss the impact. What you need is the people who can impact the data to be interacting with the data.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of The Dime. I'm Brian Fields, and with me, as always, is Kellen Finney. And this week, we got a very special guest, Murphy Murri. Murphy, thanks for taking time. How you doing today?
Doing pretty well. Thanks for having me.
Excited to have you here. Kellen, how are you doing?
Doing really well. Really excited to talk to Murphy. Really excited that I got another Colorado person on the podcast, right? Woo woo. Yeah, excited to dive into a bunch of topics today. How are you, Brian?
Yeah, I'm stoked. We're going to get this quickly out of the way because I got nothing here on Murphy. So, Murphy, we've got a little East Coast, West Coast battle. If you want to put yourself on the map, let's do it. And then let's get into the hot topics.
I mean, I grew up in Utah, so I've been no coast my whole life. I'm really anchored to this mountain range that spans the continent, but I do like the East Coast mentality. I like the pace. So
maybe we could call it a draw, Kellen. So remember, before we get into some of the fun stuff, and I really, really, really want to dive deep into cannabis manufacturing because I don't think people understand the nuances and how complicated it is. And I think the way you've been distilling the information and helping it be clear and visible for to understand is really important. So before we get into that, can you give us a quick background about yourself and how you found your way to the cannabis space?
Yeah, I've been in the cannabis space my entire adult life, basically. I tripped and fell into it by accident. I was 21 years old and medical dispensaries were opening in Colorado under the caregiver model. There wasn't even a licensing thing. It was just like a lease and, a lot of papers. We were walking around with, stapled packets with our social security numbers on them, for a couple years there. And so I got in sort of as a fluke when it was early and I was young, which meant that I had no assets and had no reason to be risk averse. I just jumped in. And from there, we quickly got licensing. And that was straight to vertical integration, which is a crash course for anyone in business because it's a rare burden. And I quickly learned every other aspect of the business outside of where I was. And so I was running all of the retail. I was running and overseeing all of the extraction and especially the infused products. And I was trying to stay as hands-off as possible in the grow, but constantly having to set up, relocate, rebuild, rearrange, tear down and clean grows. So I've been in this industry kind of since it developed in Colorado, and Colorado was one of the first. So I have tired myself out through, just every stage. I've had to learn a lot about public policy and government that I never hoped to have to learn. I know more about building codes than I ever would have predicted. But, most of it has always been in service of coming back to the plant. And I think that's why I love being in the lab so much now, because having worked in every angle of the business, the lab is where you can see the progress the fastest, both as an industry as well as on a micro scale of one batch at a time. It feels very satisfying to be able to create a mission, set out to achieve it, and then look back at the results and analyze them all in the span of a day. And there's no other part of the cannabis business where you can do that except in the lab. Maybe taxes if you're fast at math.
I love that you highlighted that because that's also the part of the business that is the most volatile, the most kind of open for opportunities for influx and challenges and leaks and inefficiencies. So just grading cannabis as a whole right now, manufacturing 1 to 100. Where are we today, in your opinion, considered best practices?
I mean, I always love to say there's no such thing as best. There's just a lot of worst. And so, with cannabis, we have struggled to define best. If you were to ask that question from the perspective of a regulator, best practice is going to be compliance heavy. And that's how you get metric. A ton of data with no useful subtext, with no useful context, with no useful action items. So, along those terms, I think that the industry has actually done a really great job of doing nothing in terms of, proving we can comply, setting up, really complex infrastructures and figuring out how to navigate them. Every time that a state onboards a new licensing program, the fact that it ever comes to any completion is impressive because there's a tremendous amount of effort for no reason, not in service of the cannabis plant. Maybe they have a reason, but the reason isn't cannabis. And so, on that end, I'd say that we do a great job overall. The amount of diversion that you don't hear about is significant because these are outliers. But if we look at best practices from the perspective of occupational health and safety, my goodness, show me a facility in America that can tolerate an OSHA inspection today. We're so far away. And we're far away in terms of actually, implementing safety systems, but also recognizing the role. Because so many people got into cannabis from these disparate, random backgrounds, it gets really difficult to know who is an expert. Someone who's great at growing is rarely great at taxes. Someone who's great at taxes knows nothing of sanitizing your drip irrigation system. Someone who does know about sanitizing your drip irrigation system does not necessarily know how to make sure you're safe with flammable compressed gases. There's not a ton of overlap when we look at employee health and safety. And in most businesses, we don't even have HR to start with baseline for working overtime, not having their paychecks show up late, not being harassed in the workplace. We're really far away from best practices for employee and occupational health. It's really dramatic. And then if we want to look at best practices in terms of actual products we're producing, we have made up a category of consumer good without defining those best practices. So that, can quickly become a West Coast, East Coast battle, right? That can quickly become a geographical battle. I think that we are better with edibles than we've ever been. And I think we're probably worse with flower than we've ever been. And everything that comes in between on that is very geographical. It's very, who's doing it where, because we do learn something every time a new market opens up, but we never connect it all. It's still a la carte at every step. And so best is so difficult, I think, for any business, because someone who's going to excel in one of those areas is lucky enough to have some one or two people who are really, well educated and experienced in that category with the power to execute it. And even if you have experienced people in each of those roles, if they don't have the authority to implement, if they don't have, aligned priorities with the rest of the team, they can't be effective. And in that way, we are all walking straight uphill. We are far away from each other on that.
So when we talk about operational efficiencies and aligning KPIs for, let's say, most product through or efficiencies, how do teams define that, and how do they understand on a regular basis, are we hitting those metrics to be successful?
The number one thing I see is that if I were to ask someone about, quality-oriented data points, they're going to return compliance-oriented data points back to me. And so, people really are thinking about KPIs as they relate to compliance. They're not thinking about them from the perspective of their unique manufacturing capacity. They're rarely thinking of them from the perspective of their unique financial position in a market. They rarely have the tools to think about it from the unique scientific perspective of what is even possible within their, given input material and potential output performance. So it's really tricky. And I think the one thing that people measure most is just sort of blanketed everywhere else. And so it comes back to just grams in, grams out, straight up compliance yield. The data that people rely on most are these real broad numbers that are outcomes. They're not really actionable items. They're measured at the end, which is after I can do anything about it. It's an important data point. It is just supposed to be the climax of a much longer story. And I'm getting no prologue from any of these people's data sets. They're not giving themselves any context with which to apply it. And so then you have people who will report back to you an average yield across their fresh frozen trim and random remediation bud. And it's like, that is a number that no one needs. That's not useful. Can't do anything with that.
How much of this do you think is rooted in like where the industry is from a maturity perspective, right? Because like a lot of people got licenses, right? And it was almost like, hey, I have permission to do this. And like, now I just need to do it, keep the lights on, pay my bills. And like, there wasn't any other assistance that normal businesses get, right? Like banking or other kind of capital from like a federal perspective, right? And so a lot of it was kind of just like, hey, we need to like make payroll next month, which then kind of creates this culture. Right. And so do you think that like you're just kind of seeing this remnants of that culture just throughout a lot of these companies that are like, oh, wow, we're still around 10 years later. Like, what do we do now?
I would say yes. But I would also bring up the fact that the traditional market was always good at this. The traditional market operators had to at all times balance the quantity that they were producing and the value that the quality of that quantity would return for them. You know, there was an understood expectation of quality in every, traditional market deal. And because there wasn't a number to attach it to, they had to communicate that. And so when I think about a traditional market, there was so much transparency because you can't collect points on a transaction unless you know what those other people are doing and how much is moving and did it look like it was supposed to or not. Everyone relied on a little bit more of the honor system when it came to reporting. But, back in the day, you were motivated to do a good job trimming because you got paid by the pound for it. Your incentives aligned with the desired outcome that whoever was paying you was, decided you were worth paying for. So, to have that alignment in the traditional market get evaporated by the pace at which people had to grow with their small business is really tough because I think what it illustrates is that you have sort of administrative management who's used to banking resources conflicting with the slow growth that comes with that traditional operator experience because they had to, they inherently always knew that they had to run at a profit because you needed re-up money, and so they didn't have a bank account, but they had re-up money. And what we see in today's world is people without a bank account or re-up money trying to act like that's any way to get by. And that's, none of our collective experience supports that. But when we all get together, what we do have to recognize is the compromises that we make. And so when you have to earn for re-up money to stay afloat, you don't get to grow fast. And it really is the speed of that expansion where people just trip over big obstacles. They just forget one category. They just measure for square feet instead of cubic feet. And here we are, way, way, way off,
You mentioned the outcome-based data point, but you said you're not getting any of the earlier story. If I gave you a magic wand and I said, Murphy, tell me all the data points you want to have a complete picture, what would those be?
Moisture content, starting there. Absolutely. Moisture content during the cultivation, moisture content at the time of harvest, moisture content at every point of repackaging, so that I can see not just what the status currently is, but what has happened to it historically. I think that moisture tells a really important story about the storage of our biomass over time. And it's one of the larger numbers in the mass of that biomass, which is important. Because I can't accurately measure terpene content. I can't accurately measure low levels of heavy metals, low levels of BTEX and other, harmful aromatics. I can't really measure a lot of contaminants at the flower face. But if I can measure water the entire time, then when I find contaminants at the end, I can go back and figure out where concentration has occurred. And this is, I think, a really important angle that we could take from both sides as labs to measure what we're doing and what is possible for us, but also to rebuild trust with our cultivators, because I do believe that no one wants to be doing a bad job. Most growers want to grow good weed. The days when growers bragged about being a grower have kind of shifted, because I think a lot of people are working in grows, not doing things that they're super excited about. And part of that is because they can't prove the value. If you work harder to grow more aromatic weed and we're going to over dry it and store it in black and yellow bins and trash bags and turn it into distillate, you just don't get any wins there. But if you could measure it and show it as weight, that'd go pretty far in the meeting. And so it's really hard to measure the terpene content that you add, but it's not hard to measure the moisture. And the moisture tells water tells an important story. And so I would start there. And as it moves on, water tells an even more important story throughout the extraction and packaging and formulation process. Water is going to tell us a lot about the environment it's being processed in. Water is going to indicate to us whether our solvents are still clean. Water is going to indicate shelf stability when we get to final products. So, moisture is lacking on everybody's pie chart. And it's one of the easiest ones for us to test. And I think that context would be huge and could be used at every single level of manufacturing so that we have something we can all talk about in a really tangible way. A lot of times I'm talking to extractors about how to control the moisture content of their flower before they start their extraction process. But I promise you that if I talk to the growers who produce that flower, they would tell you they would love another dehumidifier in the room. And that's where to solve the problem. Telling extractors to freeze everything in an open container for 24 hours gets me through this batch. But I don't get to fix that problem unless I go back to that hot, sweaty flower room and figure out how to offload some of that excess moisture. And so, simple data points, I think, can provide a lot of context. And the problem is moisture is not regulated. It's not mandated by anybody. And it ties directly to every other data point we collect. It's just outside of the compliance bubble. And so moisture is a really easy one. From there, I think that we have a lot of others that we could pay close attention to depending on what is important to us. Part of moisture control is to control for aromatic retention. It's also to prevent microbial growth. And if I have one of those problems versus the other, there's other data points that I would want to track and measure. An easy one to knock off the list is just container changes. Every time you rebag flour, you made 2 mistakes, in recent history, because a lot of time is wasted in repackaging in cannabis. And that is another one that I think would be really valuable for people to look at. If I saw how many times a bag had been opened, that would go a long way. And right now, that's why it was turkey bags. So that we could reach in and get a pinch quick, It was not in favor and in service of the cannabis. And so, looking at some things like the containers that are required for compliance, if we approach that level of compliance and paired it up with quality and said, I want to make sure that this never gets opened again. So we always package in these specific quantities to avoid that. Oh, it just goes so much further, especially when you're vertically integrated. I think about all the people who have growers put weed in a bag, and then they have extractors take weed out of a bag to put it in another bag. And that's a lot of bagging. And they could have done it once, and that alone is probably 20 hours of labor a week in savings. And I don't want to think about how many trichomes on the floor, all of them, so many. So little things about, just the life cycle of that product would go a really long way. We talk so much about seed to sale, and nobody's using seeds and nobody cares about sales and manufacturing. We're in the middle where we're making it, and we're missing that entire historical background, which is insane. Honestly, it's insane.
I think moisture, though, too, a lot of it is people go to record this data, and the next thing you know, no one does anything with it. They're just oh, I have 5 years of moisture data, right? And so providing them like insights on how to utilize the data, I think is super valuable. I think the other thing too, that's kind of moisture is a unique topic because it isn't compliance related. So that it has become like this lever that a lot of like potency increases are probably directly correlated to moisture manipulation, right? And like moisture is like a general category of water, right? Like there's free water, there's water activity, there's like a whole slew of like how the water molecules like binded, not binded, blah, 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 right? That's a whole subject in and of itself, right? It's just like actually how the water is interacting with the plant. So like when you explain to individuals or processors like, hey, like if you just monitor this moisture content throughout it, are they like, oh, light bulb moment, or like what's that conversation like?
No. I live for a whiteboard because I usually have to draw a picture, and I'm a big fan of analogies, so I try to figure out what's going to work for people so that I can kind of report it back to them, because depending on who I'm talking to, if I'm talking to executive business owner level individual, I want to bring them, how this data collection, which they see as a burden of extra work, how that is going to translate into dollars. And sometimes that's a shortcut of translates into, time savings. Sometimes it's, to maximize the yield and not be throwing away extras. Sometimes it's to simply avoid compliance failures. And so, it's reducing your overall risk of failure. But it's usually going to be converting this number into a different number that's the outcome they want. Whereas when I'm talking to the operational staff, they also see my request as more work. And what they want to know is, will this work be seen by their managers? Is the more work I'm asking them to do going to be valued and respected and recognized by the people who evaluate them? And how is it going to actually impact their outcomes? Because not only do they not want to do more work, they don't want to do more work for no reason. And so the executive level don't really tend to care about the reason why it works. They care about the outcome of those reasons. And so being able to communicate that by controlling humidity in that grow room is going to reduce their dry time so that they don't have to build a bigger dry room. They can just dry a little bit faster because they don't have to evacuate 98% water content in the dry room. They'd only evacuate 80% because they've got much lower humidity in the grow room. Oftentimes what a grower will do is explain that the plants are unhealthy and unhappy in those high humid temperatures. And no one has sympathy or empathy for those plants. Oh, the plants are uncomfortable. I don't have a spreadsheet for that. Discomfort of plants is not a category in QuickBooks. So like, what do I do with that information? But if I can illustrate that into faster dry time, reduce the microbial potential, if I can illustrate that by staying under, 0.5 water activity the entire time I'm growing, I'll never fail a test. That's what it takes. And so in most of these cases, the grower knows that control over that humidity is going to help. I don't have to convince them of that. Most of those cases, the extractor knows that freezer burned fresh frozen runs poorly and has problems. I don't have to convince them of that. But what I have to convince their upper management of is how that turns into worse numbers, because they often average it. And so people make enough good decisions to compensate for their horrible decisions, and they still end up right below where a functioning business should be, probably. And so it's always two pitches. It's always, how do I impact your outcome and skip the backstory for the people who don't need it, and then make sure I cover the backstory in the middle so that when people who are asking for data are asking the right questions and the people who are providing it understand how they're impacting it. A lot of times the experts on the floor are not the experts in the room making the decision. And while it's unfortunate, that is actually kind of normal. A good CEO doesn't necessarily have to know how every piece of equipment works, but what he does have to know is how to find out if it's working at its optimal conditions. And so as long as the questions we're asking are aligned and, the numbers that we're asking each other relate to each other, it works out to have those two perspectives. Not everybody needs to know everything, but everybody needs to know why what they're reporting is important. And, that sort of delegation in responsibility is pretty rare, I think. A lot of times you have a decision maker who lacks context, or you have a context owner who lacks any ability to make decisions. And it's not effective. It's not going to do anything.
The conversation points about the data, I think, are so important, right? Exactly like we talked about. Does the data get used? Is it valued by the manager? Is it then actionable enough to make a difference going forward? And then what seems to happen is sometimes an individual like yourself comes in and is like, listen, there's problems here. Let's make these fixes. For a short term, they're like, cool, we'll start recording everything down. Manager's like, hey, we're doing everything way better. Then a month down the line, they're like, well, someone took a step out. I stopped looking at the data and everything starts to get kind of lost. So do organizations need to become more data eccentric, kind of focusing on how to utilize that data going forward? Is it a mindset shift, or is it an understanding that early on we're going to have to collect enough data and the right types of data to make decisions? We're going to build this organization with potentially a tool so that we can instill a forward-looking successful company, because what we've all seen is margin compressions happening, numbers becoming even more tighter from a COGS standpoint. And if you're not doing enough to see what that full picture is, you're only getting actionable results, and then you can't go back and fix it because you're always going to have new pieces of information coming forward. So how do organizations get in front of this freight train and then continue to be successful moving forward?
I think it's always easy to say we don't have enough data. And then the way that you try to solve that problem is, I think, where the opportunity lies and where a lot of mistakes are made. So one way to get more data is to collect it from more places, which is what a lot of people try to do. And that's how you end up with the worst quality paper towels I've ever seen and the most excessive solvent waste I've ever seen in the same business. And it's like, why are we saving $5 on a box of paper towels when we exhaust $500 a day in nitrogen for no reason, And so a lot of times looking at more data doesn't make it easier for us to find the point of impact. In my opinion, one of the best ways to use more data is to dial in tighter on one piece of data that we know has impact. And we can do this one at a time. It may not be that you have to measure the moisture content in every bud in a flower room forever. But if you measured the moisture content from a bud on every plant in a flower room for a month, you would create a data set that you could tie to your CO2 usage, to your environmental conditions, to the yield at the end of that harvest. And if you dialed in enough, if we got enough data points close together, we could actually start to impact them. One of the biggest issues with our data is timing. And that's why the compliance data is so ineffective, because compliance data is not about what is happening now. It's about what you are allowed to do and what you have already done. And that is theoretical to the people who are in the lab in the moment. Those batches are over or yet to come. We're not thinking about that. But real-time data has real-time action. The thing about taking action is you can't do it in the past. And I can't actually do it in the future because we have these huge gaps in our understanding of who we will be in the future and the conditions we will have in the future. I always have more time tomorrow than today in my mind, in spite of the same 24 hours existing endlessly. And so that same bias gets applied within the business. We always assume that our overall cost is going to go down because our overall sales is going to go up. We always have these optimistic views for the future, and that's fine, but we can't react to that today. The action has to be as fast to implementation as the data comes back to us, and the speed of data is very painful. When I look at the analytical testing that we do, testing for the microbial activity in a gummy after I've made oil extract from flower and then processed it and infused it is just the worst time to find out I have microbes or heavy metals. There's 1,000 places it could have happened. And so the cheaper option is always to test at every stage and never have to fail at the end. But the only way we seem to learn that is by failing at the end. finding out that real cost, working backwards. And so a lot of times our action is, again, compliance oriented. We don't take action until there is a risk from compliance. And I understand the importance of it, but that should be our last line of defense. That should be, enforced at the final gates, but certainly not the way that we, wage our battles in between. We've got to be approaching this data faster, more times, in a more micro scale,
I think it's also important to mention that, like, with compliance data, it's like a mindset, right? Like, people go to like do their compliance data and it's a chore. So then it's like data entry. They check out, right? It's just like 25 into that cell, right? Like, here we go. I got it done. Now I can go home. And there's not that like thoughtfulness that needs to go into like the data, like management aspect when you're actually recording it, right? Like, if you're looking at data to like optimize a specific process or with that in mind, like, you're recording those numbers with a completely different mindset. And that's where a lot of these insights are going to lead to. So that's where it's really hard to decouple. Like, it's almost like a completely different data management system at that point, right?
It can be. I think that they just have to be overlapping. I think that compliance data is a different job than operational data. And to that end, they can be a different person. I think that compliance data should be automated and probably AI. And it could be extrapolated from operational data so that the people. Exactly.
We got handwritten logs, guys.
Not in California.
We write things down on paper.
It's such a burden. Yeah. And so, think of it in the context of, let's say we're talking about a sprint, a race, right? If you're the runner and you're running in a race, you do need to know how fast you finished. But more importantly, you need to know how fast everyone else in the race finished. Because knowing that you won is great, but knowing that you only won by 1/10 of a second is important compared to if you won by a entire half a second, an entire whole second. And if you didn't win, that gap is even more important. And so when I think about the operator, they need to know not just if they met expectations, but how far away they are. Because if they don't believe the expectations are reasonable, they're not going to pursue them. If they don't trust that what's being asked of them can be done, they're not going to try as hard to achieve that. And so you end up with these sort of self-defeating goals where we say, we want to average 6% returns on all our fresh frozen. That's great. It's not helpful. That's not, that pizza party's never coming. So we have to give people a goal that they can hit, which is to increase the yields that you had last quarter by 0.1%. Or to, close the gap. Last quarter, the potential yield and your actual yield were this far apart. This year, this quarter, our potential yield and our actual yield are going to be this far apart. We want to give you an incremental goal that is smaller so that it can be achieved. And the impact of that goal will not be small. The impact of that goal in the second half of my pitch up the executive ladder is, 0.1% is thousands of dollars. And it's thousands of dollars in 10 different categories in your accounting spreadsheets. You're going to save money all of the places where it counts. And so if we can get a directive up top of which areas are the biggest burden, and we can get a directive from down low about which areas are the biggest burden, they often overlap. They just aren't called the same thing. It's a conversational problem almost. And part of it is because the minutia of the, constant data collection does not need to be in a spreadsheet that goes up that executive chain. That needs to be a spreadsheet that the people who are interacting with that equipment on the day need to see. I don't need my CFO to keep and have access and be reviewing the temperature log for my distillation system. I have spoken to many CFOs about how the temperature logging is working for their distillation system. I'm so excited that they want to learn about distillation. It is not helpful to them to do their job, and it is not helpful to the staff to do their job to have to teach this guy about how molecular distillation works. What is important is for him to understand that in this area, we're hitting our goals. in yield, in energy, in whatever is most important. What's important for the staff is to know that when they track all of those data points, they can follow it to those outcomes. And a lot of times what you have is staff tracking data points and then someone else coming in to analyze them. That's insane. Of course, they're not going to trust that guy. Of course, that guy doesn't, have the right perspective and he's going to miss the impact. What you need is the people who can impact the data to be interacting with the data. And a lot of people only collect it. It's like the cleaning checklist in a public bathroom. Who puts 20 lines on that form? Ain't nobody ever filled out 20 lines of a bathroom cleaning checklist, Like no one is going in and actually wiping the mirror, checking it off, wiping the toilets, checking it off. That's never happened. And it doesn't make the bathroom cleaner to put that burden on somebody. And so being able to report it in a more functional way is way more important. You get way cleaner bathrooms when there's a button that you can push that says this bathroom needs attention. And so instead of reporting how often you clean it, you report how often it gets dirty. It's a big shift.
Yeah, it's a mindset shift. And there's a few things I want to highlight there. You talked about the real-time data, right? And how valuable that is. And it kind of expanding on that is the integration of digital sensors inside these process facilities allow for skipping of those steps, right? Now the operator doesn't need to track 20 things. Everything gets transmitted automatically to a system. And now all that data is piped there. And the most interesting aspect is cannabis is not the first industry to do chemical manufacturing.
No.
So we can utilize tools of other industries for real-time process control in order to implement best practices. And we continue to see companies a little more hesitant for that change. But I think it's exactly what you described. It is the mindset shift. And my anticipation is that a few companies will start to pick this up, and we've already seen this now. And it'll be an avalanche of momentum being like, how did you accelerate so fast? How did you get your COGS down so low? How did you get so much visibility into your process? How did you understand what to do with all your data? And it turns out you utilize tools from other industries to implement best practices here in cannabis.
Right. That's why my motto is more hash faster. How do you do anything? You make more of it faster. And I will either learn more or get better at it faster. I'm either going to change my technique or improve it, to be able to create robustness through repetition rather than wide expansion is exactly the position we should be in, especially because the only unique thing about cannabis is cannabis. So let's dial in so specific on cannabis and let everything else be very standard. We could borrow it from every other industry that's done that work. And why wouldn't we? Everybody loves to have their explicitly proprietary data, but, not understanding something is not the same as having a proprietary method. Sometimes people get so in their own weeds about the complexity of their issues that they really can't step back and look at it. And, even that is a great opportunity for AI, where you can type in all of your data points and say, hey, AI, imagine that these were the conditions of my direct competitor. What would I do to compete with them? What could I do to take advantage of their flaws in their business model? Sometimes getting outside your own perspective is critical. And if you have the data, then you can get that perspective really easily. A lot of times as a consultant, when I'm coming in, my goal is first to teach people how to collect data. And then after they've collected some, to come back and teach them how to analyze it. If they're already proactively collecting it, then every time I come in, we can have a much more effective conversation about analysis, because every time I give a piece of advice, it is a step on a ladder that leads to the next one. Most of the time, my advice is you have 3 potential causes of the issue. You have 3 to 5 ways you can approach it. Pick one, tell me what you did and how it happened. And the decision tree goes on, and it gets very ineffective when we try to do that with 10 different things at a time. But if we can dial in really tight at one step in the process at a time and get perfect at them, then the decision tree starts to become reasonable. Now it's yes, no's instead of if thens. And from a manufacturing perspective, we want a lot of yes, no's. We want that binary. Is it ready to go? Not ready to go. Is it approved? Is it not approved? Is it rejected? Is it in progress? And we are pretty far away from that. We have extensive if-thens in cannabis, and most of them are by design, but accidental design. And usually as a consequence of a different decision made in another department. Sometimes it's, this is the building we could rent. So we do a lot of crazy things to deal with a short ceiling. Or we do a lot of crazy things to deal with we don't have enough power. You know, somewhere, some point we made a compromise. And sometimes you can overcome those compromises and start choosing differently. Sometimes we have to start from this shaky foundation and support it in other ways. But it is all very doable. And I think that what a lot of businesses miss is they overestimate their ability to identify their own weaknesses. Like, we are all better at identifying other people's problems. We are all better at determining what other people should do to solve those problems. We are rarely good at doing that for ourselves. And the same is true in these businesses. And so just because you have managers in every room doesn't mean that they have the insight. And even if they have the insight, do they have the authority to do anything with that insight? These are tough questions in this industry because nobody does it the same way. You know, the word standard operating procedure is used to mean almost any piece of printed paper that people don't read. So
you're not wrong.
We're starting from a very tricky falling down staircase, you know, as far as
but it's super dialed in, Murphy. We've got it really dialed in.
The more binders you have, the more I know that no one's ever read them. You know what I mean? Like, do they have color-coded tabs? Oh, no one's ever read that. Like, it's
not even the person that like spent 4 days making the colored tabs, they didn't read it at all, but they did a job.
Their job was binders.
I know,
and they did it
and they did a great job.
Yeah.
So then teams like go through their process, like specifically in extraction, right? They've got biomass variability. Right. They go through their system. They've got some sort of challenges there. They want to soak for a certain amount of time, but they can't do that. Then they've got quality issues. So they do a second pass. Where in that process would you say to yourself, okay, this isn't going the way I want. Maybe I need to reconsider our flow to say, if I make this adjustment here, maybe I don't do a second pass and I'll lose a little bit here, but I'll improve on my quality and my cost. I think the speed sometimes of the industry of moving as fast as possible kind of blends into the challenge of, okay, we got to get another run up. We don't have time to go back and change it. Bob's not here. He's our best guy. We'll wait till he comes back. And now it's 3 days down the road. And they're like, all right, well, next time we get green crack, then we'll run it. So where, if you were in charge of this business, where would you position yourself and be like, okay, I don't think this is going right. The alarm bells are going off my head. Now is the time to really reconsider how to change this.
So there's quite a few opportunities that people get throughout the course of the business where they can address it right away. And I think one of the easiest ones that people miss is that they don't put a lot of thought into their purchase agreements for some of their large scale equipment. And so then when the performance parameters, details, data points that those equipment manufacturers share with them are not met in real life, they have no legal recourse. And in fact, are usually bullied into paying for more training, more consulting, more, ongoing additional cost support from that company. Or they just say, I don't like that company. And then they go and try to save up to buy another system from another company. They don't hold these manufacturers accountable for the performance of the system. That's something that the executive team is built for. My goodness, get the binder guy. Let's go. This is the time. Hold manufacturers accountable for what they promised you. And if they can't, you can build that into your contract so that you at least have some financial compensation to cover the gap. Because while I appreciate that so many of these manufacturers fail to meet those expectations because it gives me a job, it'd be even better if those manufacturers were paying me instead of those customers who have now had to pay two people twice. Because now by the end of my training, they have a new list of other stuff they need to buy, and they're just running further and further out of money. So start by holding people accountable for the promises that they've made. These equipment manufacturers should be held to a higher standard when it comes to being able to promote what their equipment can do. And so a lot of people get in over their heads on cost and on their ROI day one because the equipment was sold based on a set of operating conditions that will never be met. And so that's a huge place to shift from right away, is don't even start making any kind of financial projections until that equipment is installed and validated in place for real operating parameters. And then once those exist, you've got to revisit them every so often. And you've got to set a depreciation schedule in effect for that operational efficiency for certain types of equipment, because a lot of people compromise their maintenance in favor of extracting more today because they'll have time next month, next week, tomorrow to take on those extra tasks. Not only will you not have time later, but you will actually be less efficient every day as you fail to meet those goals. You know, it's like if you don't get your oil changed, you literally use more gasoline in your car. Like, you know, like everything gets less efficient. And so the compromise is not happening all at once later or all at once today. It's every day over time. And this is something that I see a lot with expansion for people. So, you know, they bought equipment, they had a disappointment. They bought equipment, they put someone in charge of the lab, they couldn't do what they were hired to do. Now they're in a deficit and they want me to come in and say, how do we help with this? And I always want to start by saying, what worked before? What was working so well that you made those other decisions, right? And sometimes what worked well is they were great at cultivating. And so then they said, we didn't know that much about extraction. We hired the wrong person. We trusted the wrong company. You know, I want to figure out where their background is. And that'll usually give me some pretty good insight about where the issues are. If they started in cultivation, that's excellent, because now I know that it's not a starting material issue as likely, and that it's more of a handling and operational support issue once they get into the lab. And if they don't have the cultivation as their background, then maybe it is a starting material issue. Maybe it is a quality control on the input issue. Everybody's kind of got different strengths or weaknesses in a business, but even if they have a lot of diversity in their staff, one or two people are usually the ones who have the greatest impact on those decisions. And so that's who I look for, is who sets the tone in there. And then what I need to figure out is how to convince that person to help everybody else see their vision. Because we do tend to all want the same thing. We do tend to all want to make the best product at the end of the day. And it's just a question of how we get there. I could give you a literal example where, you know, someone could go from making really high quality distillate in a short path, and they dial in that short path, and it's all glassware and it's different components, and they dial it in tight, and they know that this is what their incoming crude needs to look like. And if it's not even winterized the way they want, they're not going to put it in their short path. They're going to be very specific. And the reason they know that is because when it's time to clean that short path, it's not going to be a good time if they lower their standards on that input material, because they can see it because it's glass. And then they make so much of that distillate that they hit a limit. And the question becomes, do we make a continuous, or do we keep doing 16-hour passes on the world's biggest short paths? And so now they pivot technology. And instead of having glass where they can see, they're going to have a wiper where they can't see what's going on inside. Instead of having thermocouples that are on the vapor in the distillation head and in the oil where it's being heated, they go to no thermocouples anywhere and just set points on heaters. And, you know, they start trying to run the same distillation product on equipment that has none of the same features. They can't run it visually anymore, and they can't run it by temperature anymore. And suddenly their quality goes down because it runs continuous and they need to keep feeding it. They don't do as good of a job winterizing it anymore. They don't do as good of a job making sure it's fully decarboxylated anymore, because since they can't see the eruption that would have happened in a short path when it hits in their wiper, they're immune to it. And all of that leads them from that point now to just continuing problems. So not only did they make several bad decisions in a row in terms of the equipment and the way that they change their operating process, but they also are now still accumulating the grime. So the lessons they already learned before, they're not fixing anymore. And all of that is because they didn't collect the data points till the end. If you wait to find out that the distillate is going to be low quality at the very end of that process, it's already made. But if you had the real-time checks of the glass, of the thermometers, of your, real-time vacuum data, you would have known and you would have adjusted. The people running short paths before were interacting with it highly so that they could keep it bubbling at the same speed, so that they weren't having these gaps where it was just getting hot and steamy. And as soon as we switched to wiped film, you have a lot of operators who literally are just moving the kegs around and, are connecting hoses. And so they got away from those tangible details. And when we took away their tangible real-time data and feedback, we took away all of their connection to that output. We took away all of their connection to the impact that they have on the process. You can do the same dialing with a white film that you do in a short path, but you have to look at the same data from different sources. And sometimes the equipment doesn't support that goal. And so I think for me, it's always trying to figure out when and where the initial shift and deviation from the good plan occurred. And sometimes it's very early. Bought the wrong stuff day one and it's not getting better. Hired the wrong person day one and it's not getting better. But sometimes it happens as the result of success, which I think is where a lot of people are at. They succeeded somewhere and it allowed them to get in over their heads in another area.
Last question for you, process optimization. How fast of return on investment is this for most companies?
It depends on where they're spending their money. So, if we assume that the equipment costs are sort of depreciated and lost, then, the return is pretty fast. But because of the banking issue, a lot of people are having to pay cash for equipment. And that is where we are very far from other industries. Nobody else is paying full price up front for their equipment. That's usually absurd. And so because a lot of people pay cash for equipment, that's where the biggest gap comes from. And if you overspend on equipment day one, if you have to buy, multiple versions of that equipment to get it right, that can eat you up. But if we're talking about consumable costs, same day. If we're talking about payroll costs, a month, maybe. And if we're talking about, some of the downstream rework and, avoiding failed tests, that will be as fast as your access to data. And so if it takes a week for you to get a turnaround on test results, you could do it in 2 weeks. And if it takes you a month to get enough of that testing data together to look back at your batches, it's going to take you a month to turn it around. It's going to, really be about as fast as you can take the time to collect the data and review the data. And so that's where it gets granular in terms of how you've set up your business. Do you have people in charge of data who have context for it? And are you prioritizing the right data? And those two jobs can be adding another human, but also removing a lot of rework, for example. And so you really have to be able to balance the whole picture for some of these to see the true impact.
So Murphy, give our listeners just a quick pitch on the type of services you provide and let them know where they can reach out and find you if they need your help in the future.
Sure. I've got a website, murphymurri.com, easiest place to find me. And I'm also on a bunch of social media. I do a lot of podcasts to answer questions in a little bit more long form. So I, recommend those to a lot of people if they have specific questions. The services that I offer are really general consulting services. I would say that a lot of times I'm being hired on in moments of transition for businesses where they've just purchased equipment or are about to purchase equipment. And to those people, I would always say, if you can ever choose, hire me before you buy something. Let's optimize what you have before you buy something new as much as possible. I'm happy to come and help you after you've bought something. It's just worse to give you bad news for me personally. So if I can catch you where we still have a lot of potential, that's awesome. And, the same goes for hiring and training people. If you're unsure if your staff are performing where they need to be, if you are losing trust in the management there, that's where I can provide a lot of support. And that might be because your management staff at the operational level doesn't trust the executives, or vice versa. And in both cases, I can be a third party to more objectively come in and explain both sides, because it is almost always both rather than one. Occasionally there's a bad apple, but usually you know that before I show up. So, my services range from training on the equipment you have to developing and designing a lab flow and a workflow for new equipment so that you can optimize an existing process, add more products to the workflow, or control costs, especially when they're getting out of hand.
I love it. We'll link it all in the show notes. Thanks for taking the time. This was a lot of fun.
Definitely. Appreciate it.